Hello, friends. My name is host Eric. I'm the host of Talking with Famous People. And I was thinking earlier as I was going pee about a single sentence that was very interesting and perhaps is very revelatory regarding people, type, the way people engage with the world, etc. The simple sentence is, if 1 plus 1 equals 2, then these words matter. Now, the reason this sentence is very interesting to me is because how a given person responds to this sentence off the bat is going to be interesting. But additionally, it's a sentence that has multiple layers of meaning to it. So your relationship with communication and your relationship with experience is going to have a lot to do with how you respond to this sentence, as well as your relationship with conceptual identities versus relational identities, plus your conceptions of truth, values, and falsification. And then I'll go into those last things later. So first, let me just sort of articulate the layers of interpretive meaning or angles of interpretation on this that I was thinking about. So foremost, probably plenty of people say, well, let me put out some possible responses. Somebody might say in response to this, well, your words matter regardless. Or does that mean if 1 plus 1 doesn't equal 2, then these words don't matter? Or somebody might respond by saying, well, 1 plus 1 doesn't actually necessarily equal 2. Or one might respond with, matter is too vague of a term. It's not clear what that means here, nor is it exactly clear which words are being referred to. Or one might think of it as this is some sort of commentary on how symbols must mean things, or else there's no point in communicating anything. Like, for the same reason that we have to respect that 1 plus 1 equals 2, so too do we have to respect that words have specific definitions, and we shouldn't. You might interpret it like that. The way I'm thinking about it when I came up with the sentence is the reason if 1 plus 1 equals 2 is the thing that determines whether these words matter is because 1 plus 1 equals 2 is the antecedent to the conditional, and these words matter is the consequent of the conditional. So let's go down to number 4, the fourth little line there, fifth little line, truth, values, and falsification. And to be clear about what I mean here, if you look at a truth table for a conditional, it's TFTT, which is to say, a conditional, which is if A then B, let's say, is true when A and B are both true. It's false when A is true and B is false. It's true when A is false and B is true, and it's true when A and B are both false. Now, let me explain why it would be structured like this. So the reason it's like that is simply because if I say, if I'm a werewolf, then you have a nuclear bomb on your head. It is a true statement in the sense that you can't call it false because the first part of the conditional never is true, so you can't ever test it, right? This is the way that conditionality works, is the only circumstances in which you can establish that statement is false is if you can establish the first part of it is true and the second part of it is false. So that's the case with this sentence here as well. Because you're never going to be able to, it says if 1 plus 1 equals 2, then these words matter. So this is a very interesting construction in that regard as well, because it's like, if the only reason the second half of the conditional matters is because the first half is true. In other words, if 1 plus 1 equals 2, which you could fill in with A here, is false, then the statement's always true, and it never matters. What do I mean by matter in this case, then? It never informs you of anything that's a piece of information at all. If I'm a werewolf, then you have a nuclear bomb on your head, is not informative at all, because I'll never be a werewolf, It's not the case that I'm a werewolf, and therefore we don't even need to hear what happens after the then. So, how you respond to this thing I'm saying right here is going to be very revelatory of your relationship with both communication cognitive functions and experiential cognitive functions. If you started off by saying, well, your words matter no matter what, Eric, then that's a very F kind of response to it, right? Like, there's a frame entrance here that says this is about human beings and the significance of their expressions. That's not how I meant it, of course, but that's how you might respond to it. If you're a TI user, a TINE, chances are, if you're an NTP or something, or maybe even an ISFJ or a ESTP or ISTP or something like that, you're likely to try to figure out where is he tricking, or how can I show that that's not necessarily the case? Where's possibly the exceptions? Of course, if you are somebody who says, well, 1 + 1 = 2 isn't necessarily the case, you're wrong about that. 1 + 1 = 2 is necessarily the case. The only way to make the case that it's not is to commit an equivocation fallacy. Which is to say, if you wanted to falsify the claim 1 + 1 = 2, you'd have to either change the meaning of the word 1 partway through, change the meaning of the word plus partway through, change the meaning of the word equals partway through, or change the meaning of the word 2 partway through. It's the only way you could possibly establish that 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. And the reason for that is because 1 and 2 and plus and equals are purely mapping symbols. So I attributed it to Boba Fett in the live stream the other night. It was actually Karma's Pimp, I recall now. Left a comment saying, I need to understand better the distinction between nominal and real definitions. So I'd not heard those terms used before to make the distinction that I'm always talking about. So it's not that I need to understand it more. It's just I'm not using your preferred terms, maybe. And this is where we get to this conceptual identity notion. So we might call the same thing by different names, but nevertheless, we're talking about the same thing. When we do stuff like that, we're discussing things in terms of their conceptual identity. If I'm talking about introverted intuition as an object of analysis of cognitive function, I'm talking about its conceptual identity. The reason I make this distinction is because, of course, introverted intuition never occurs except as an individual paying attention. So when we talk about it in isolation as an object of analysis, we're discussing aspects of it that you could call aspects of its conceptual identity. That means, which is to say, static qualities or static things that allow us to communicate about an element of a dynamic process by rendering that element into a static form so we can talk about it. Now, if you're still thinking, well, maybe 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, well, maybe you're approaching it by the units versus none example. So it's absolutely the case that 1 + 1 = 2. And the reason we know it's absolutely and always the case is because we can show how to change it such that it's not. 1 + 1 = 2 is always and necessarily the case because 2 is defined as the sum of two ones. So it's just tautology. It's the same thing as saying A = A. However, if we make this conceptual identity matter into more of a relational identity matter, then we might add units. So now, 1 orange + 1 orange = 2 oranges is true. 1 orange + 1 apple = 2 oranges is not true. We still have 1 + 1 = 2. So have I disproved that 1 + 1 = 2? No, I pointed out that when we're talking about just the symbols themselves, we're discussing things that are mapping tools. The words and, or, if then, not, have no corollary in reality. They're purely objects that exist because people communicate. And they communicate things that comprise their process of being. So, because as a being, I'm drawing distinctions like I've only got a little bit of weed left, right? It's like I gotta go to the weed store because I've only got this little bit of weed left. I might say, well, this is, let's say, like 2 bong rips worth of weed. So I have 1 bong rip and I have 1 other bong rip. Okay, the concept of and is one of those mapping words like 1 and 2. In other words, there is no and, except that I'm conjoining things conceptually with each other. It's the process of conjoining that creates the concept of and that process of conjoining is fundamentally a mapping process. It's one of communication of language and not of reality. 2 things in reality might conjoin. So, for example, a male lion might hump a female lion. You might say they're conjoining. But, of course, the idea that there are 2 distinct things and that you can put them together is the process of a sentient being mapping their reality. Saying the best way to understand this so that I can conceptually use my experience to understand other things is to map them as 2 separate beings. Okay, so let's talk about truth value and falsification. I did that already. That's the conditionality part of this. It's like what I meant there is words matter only in conditional. The words of the words of the consequent and a conditional only matter if the antecedent is true. And here I've given you a true antecedent. So in this case, I'm saying these words do matter because this statement could be false because the antecedent is true. Now I want to talk about this appeal to versus get my way. So fundamentally, there are 2 different frames of reference that comprise how people think of themselves in relation to the world. One of them, you might call it appeal to versus get my way. For FITE people, you start with, I need to get my way, and therefore, whatever I'm doing or saying needs to appeal to or validate with other people. On the other hand, FITE people are like, what I'm saying validates with everybody, so I should get my way. It might not seem like a particularly significant distinction, but it is, because if you are the get my way thing first, instead of the appeal to everybody thing first, then this statement and everything I'm saying only matters if it's consistent with your goals. Your goals, or your problem solving, or whatever else. So, for example, if you're an FI person and you don't like me and you don't want me to be right, then it doesn't matter how well I make this case. Because it's not on your agenda and you're not interested in validating things, except insofar as they are consistent with what you want. In both instances, there's a sort of accountability, right? Like, I want to go chop down this entire forest. Well, you better go ask the rest of the community, because if you just go and do it and don't, and I have a feeling everybody else is going to oppose this, so you better go check with them, right? Provide some sort of accountability onto this person who wants to chop down the whole forest. Similarly, if I'm somebody who goes, I've already checked everybody and everybody already agrees with me, and so I should get to chop down the forest, there's some sort of accountability. It just occurs in a different relationship to the person who's getting accountability, right? Let me talk about the space noise example. So here's the deal. There are good explanations and bad explanations, and the best explanations are those that resonate as true or validate as true, depending on how you look at it, both conceptually in terms of their identity and relationally in terms of their identity. So relational identity matters are ones that you can check against something concrete, in other words, that you can test. So I heard this I'll watch this show, Paranormal Con Camera. Sometimes there's really weird shit on it. It's just like, what could that? That shirt certainly looks like a deer's soul leaving its body. This crazy video of it was caught on somebody's security camera of a deer getting hit by a car and then struggling its last breaths, and it falls over, and it's like clear as day. You can see like its ghost leave its body, like in the cartoons. It's freaking weird video. Anyway, so there's this other video on that show in which this woman goes outside her house and there are these loud banging noises, and it's not clear where they're coming from and what they are. And of course, after they show the clip, they invite the experts to comment on it. So there's this blonde lady who's, I think, an INFJ or an ENFJ, who's on the show that her response to it was, what could it be? Maybe it's a noise from trillions of years ago, from very distant space. It's finally reached Earth's atmosphere. And I was like, noise needs a medium to travel through. I mean, it's like, you don't understand noise very well, lady. It doesn't go through space because there's no air in space, right? But, of course, the next thing I thought was, well, how do I know there's no air in space? And just sort of a curious way to talk about explanations and stuff. So the answer is, I know there's no air in space, mostly because the explanations I've been told regarding the Earth and space and the sun and everything make sense and don't run afoul, fundamentally, of observations that would seem to disprove them. But if I were going to point out a good reason to believe there's no air in space, that's a relational kind of argumentation, I would say, well, I've been to the top of Mammoth Mountain, which is almost 12,000 feet up, and I know there's less air to breathe there. That's my experience of it anyway. Now, my experience could be deceptive. Maybe it's not that there's less air, it's just that there's less oxygen in the air, and there's the same amount of total air. Maybe it's just that my lungs don't work as well at higher elevations. It's not nothing to do with the air at all. It could be any of those things, right? But my experience and my sort of intuitive interpretation of that is that the air is thinner up high, that I can't breathe as well. There's not as much air there. So one would say, if in fact there gets less and less air as you go higher, then eventually when you get to the very top, which is say outer space, or you keep going up into the sky, there'll be no air there. Now, how do I know though that sound needs a medium to move through? Well, in that instance, it's because I believe and understand the model of sound, which says that it is in fact frequency waves moving through a medium, that our ears are designed, so to speak, to receive in ways that allow us to make meaning out of them. So, could it possibly be correct that lady's explanation for those loud noises is the best explanation or the right explanation? No. We can eliminate it as a possible explanation because we know there's no air in space. If you were somebody who goes, well, you know what, we don't know that really for sure, but no, it could still be that. Who knows? Maybe we don't know quite a way that the sound moves. Maybe the sounds move. Okay, if you're like that, then you're not getting the point of explaining things. It's true necessarily that we have to rely upon established knowledge, and we're building off of foundations that don't need to be challenged because the work's already been done. We don't need to redo all the work ourselves. So yes, we're working on an assumption that basically our description of the solar system and the galaxy and the universe is accurate. And the reason we are is because we can look at all the intellectual work that was done to justify this. We may not understand every proof that people provide of the claim that there's no air in outer space, but we might understand some of them. And if we want to disprove the claim, we need to make a better case, ultimately, because the claim is not that it's not really that there's not air in outer space. It's so much as there's outer space is the alternative to the thing that can have an atmosphere, right? It's like that. So so yes, the answer is that's not a good explanation. That's not the correct explanation. It's a wrong explanation. It's a wrong explanation because we know that it's not possible for sound to travel through space because there's no air. So in this instance, we can see that some explanations are better than others, certainly for physical phenomena, and we can use logic and knowledge as axioms to eliminate certain possibilities because they just don't make any sense. Now, note this though. That's very different than if I say something like this. If I have if I can move my fingers, I have an arm. So if I can move my fingers, I have an arm is true and valid, or whatever you want to call it. I fucking hate this thing. This bong, it needs to go. I need a new bong, and that's all there is to it. So then we're back to these sort of conceptual identities. Conceptual identity of a hand that can move its fingers requires that you have an arm. In other words, if your arm was cut off, you can no longer move your fingers. And if you can move your fingers, then you have an arm between you and your fingers, you know? So a lot of times, what's happening when we're arguing about cognitive functions or something, and people aren't understanding why I'm right or something like that, is they've insisted on dealing with a cognitive function as though it were a hand without an arm. They've insisted that this kind of thing that we're talking about, cognitive functions, isn't like the space example. That instead, it's like a literary interpretation. Well, what's the correct interpretation of why Romeo said "meow" in this scene in Romeo and Juliet? Well, as long as you've supported your conclusion well with text from the play, then every interpretation is equally correct insofar as it's equally well supported. Now, in contrast, she did a good job of supporting her explanation by pointing out that indeed light takes a long time to go across the universe, and we see it a long time after it occurs way far away, right? That is correct to point that out. But the reason she was wrong about the sound idea is that unlike light, sound needs a more viscous medium to move through, such as water or air. And so in that sense, there was a false equivalency created, and that's what caused her to be wrong. When we're talking about cognitive functions, a lot of times people get caught up saying, no, that's not NI, that's meh. So what I'm pointing out is, but the problem is this. They keep saying that's not MI, that's meh. Mostly because they don't understand that the thing they're talking about is at the end of an arm. And therefore, it can only be certain things in certain places in certain ways. If I talk about my hand as an object of analysis, I might say, well, what I'll do later is I'll put my hands in the garage. They can work on that thing over there while I'm sitting here watching TV. And that's the best way to do it. That's a conceptual identity of hands based on what they do conceptually. But it's ignoring the relational identity part, which is to say, my hands aren't independent agents. They can't do things separate from me. And if in fact I cut them off and put them in the garage, I will never be able to use them again. because they are extensions of my arms, not independent objects of analysis. So that's what people do in cognitive functions all the time. They think, like C.S. Joseph will tell you, listen, once you're a master, what you'll do is you'll chop off each arm and have it doing a different job, and then you'll chop off each leg and have it doing a different job, and then you'll have your torso digesting food, chop off your head, and it can go give a speech over there. You've mastered all the cognitive functions. I mean, that's what you would say. This is somebody who doesn't understand that a complete understanding of this includes both a conceptual identity definition and a relational identity definition, and that most importantly, because what we're doing is modeling, that the relational identities be defined in a way that's operationalized, which is to say, because they're relational identities, we can use a test to include or exclude something within or out of a set called things named Mia. So, this video, I think, lacked a certain amount of clear thesis and clear crystallization. So, I regret that. I didn't seem to be able to find the spot to come back to crystallize here. But hopefully you understand some of what I'm trying to get at in terms of our relationship with language. If all of this seems pointless word salad to you, then you definitely are not qualified to model cognitive functions. If you think the distinction between 1 + 1 = 2 and 1 orange + 1 orange = 2 oranges is not a meaningful distinction to make, or doesn't tell us anything or inform us anything about how to map reality, you are not qualified to model anything. Go play soccer or something. Because to be able to correctly model cognitive functions, you need to almost immediately understand that sentence on all of its respective levels and understand how come Joe sees that sentence through this perspective only, and when I try to explain further, their eyes gloss over and they think that doesn't matter what you're saying. If Joe comes in and says, your words matter no matter what, and so the big issue here is this sentence is wrong. It pretends as though your words sometimes don't matter. Well, then you're not qualified to do anything regarding modeling cognitive functions, because you're taking a my way first, then justify approach towards the world. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with it, but it does make it impossible for you to be good at modeling this. You're good at other things instead. The people who are most capable of modeling this need to prioritize first things that validate universally, and then decide whether they want to use that to get their way for something. And maximally that's attained in the ENTP because they've got FI polar, as well as TI tool, plus they're ideational rather than physical action types. So anyway, hopefully that video is worth watching. It was almost 30 minutes, which is way too long. I think I probably repeated myself some, but if you're still here, thank you very much, and don't forget to eat plenty of cheese.